coming. So I'm Fatima, and I'm the Deputy Director of this project. And thanks for coming out tonight. We have some beer in the back, so feel free to grab something to drink. I'll just do a short intro on our guest of honor, and then I'll hand off the mic to our guest. So tonight we're welcoming Raqs Media Collective. They were formed in 1992 and based out of New Delhi. The collective is comprised of 3 practitioners, Jabish Bagchi, Monica Narulu, and Siddhartha Sengupta. The name Raqs stems from a word in Urdu, Persia, and Arabic that means the state that whirling dervishes enter when they whirl, which is indicative of the collective's dynamic, contemplative, and mesmerizing work. Their practice, which is not limited to the creation of art and exhibition, but has collaborated with a range of architects, programmers, writers, curators, and theater directors to produce a plethora of talks, websites, conference, books, journals, etc. Grounded in art, theoretical research, historical inquiry, and philosophical speculation, Raqs engages with different documents and concepts of the archive to explore the volatility of history and memory, often in relation to post-colonialism and legacy of emancipation. So in addition to the residency with us, they are also visiting Philippines as part of their research in the upcoming Yokohama Triennale. So tonight's talk is titled Diving and Thinking, where they will kind of explore, it's a presentation of the current stage of their practice, and they will present the eddies and currents of their thinking, the things that occupy their triangulated minds, which will range from with a concern with the futures of histories of materials and energies, as well as forays into shipwrecks, mines, and spaces of open and hidden power. So let's give a welcome to Raqs Media Collective.
Thank you, Fatima, and good evening, and thank you all for being daunting adventurers who have made it through Manila traffic, which we've enjoyed and experienced. It gives you a lot of time to think about things. Today's presentation is staged as a very informal conversation between ourselves. That's Jibesh, who's sitting in the audience, because it's good to plant someone in your public. You can ask the awkward question. And Monica and I have been working, as Fatima said, for
many years.
Too many. Can't. Since the 20th century.
27 years.
Yes, 27 years. And we live and work, as she said, in Delhi. And our coming together was through a proclivity for conversation between us. We were students together at a film school, at a film and media school, not an art school. And we were training to be documentary filmmakers when we met. And that is, in a sense, one of the many possible foundations of the practice. But it produces itself through a practice of daily conversation and through a history of conversation. We've been having some really interesting talk with some young artists and curators here at the Eskwela over the last 2 days, and one of the metaphors we were trying to think with was fault lines of the volcanic, given the nature of the geology of the Philippine archipelago. And we were very interested in seeing how things that are deeper down in the earth find ways to come up and disturb the stratigraphy, so that your sense of when a layer of rock succeeds or precedes another layer of rock can be disturbed by a kind of by the magma and its memory and its movement. So it's a bit like that with our practice. There's layers and layers of conversation, arguments, disputes, shared images, ideas, and sometimes they collide with each other, because if you think of us as 3 tectonic plates constituting one little triangulated, mini asteroid in the wandering system of planets, then those tectonic plates also collide with each other, and sometimes things go up and down, and things issue forth from the history of the practice, and also are called into it from the anticipations of its future. And that's what we thought we would give you a sense of today. It's not so much to talk about our curatorial work, because that's a separate question, but it's to give you a sense of the ideas, the images, the ghosts, and the voices that animate our current thinking and work together. So we're going to begin with an image that has been working its way into our minds for a while now, and this connects with the question of diving and thinking, of what happens when you dive into the thick of things and what happens when you think, and when is a form of diving a form of thinking, and when is a form of thinking a form of diving. This is an artifact in the Archaeological Museum in Athens, which we came across some time ago, and it's called the Statue of the Broken Philosopher.
Just the broken.
It's just called the Broken Philosopher, and it was found in excavations to do with a shipwreck. A ship sailing from one part of the Aegean Sea to another was drowned in more than 2,000 years ago, and was then rediscovered 100 years ago by pearl divers, by people diving for pearls in the Aegean. And at first they couldn't quite make out what they were seeing. And one of the phenomena that we discovered happens to divers is that they get into a kind of delirium. I'm sure that there are diving communities here who dive for a living, and they would know that if you dive beyond a certain depth, the pressure begins to play tricks on your nervous system, and there's a certain kind of, it's called the rapture of the deep, which begins to play tricks with the mind. And the divers saw things in the shipwrecks that nobody believed that they could have seen. Over the 100 years, this particular shipwreck yielded a remarkable set of objects, including what might have been the world's first analog computer. It's called the Antikythera mechanism. It's a system of gears and wheels made to calculate positions on sea and in the sky. And also this statue, which, because it's sort of inflected in the posture of its hand, was considered to be a philosopher, meaning it's like as if this body was trying to think and say something.
And also the fuddled.
So for us, this object represented a kind of enigma and a puzzle. First of all, it means that what do you do with a broken philosopher? Can you put a broken philosopher back together again? Can you make a broken philosopher's parts? Can you join them in such a way that they constitute some kind of new whole or something like that? And that set off a whole process of thinking, which tied into some of the other thinking that we were doing, to suggest that diving, which has been a preoccupation of ours, what do you do when you dive? The figure of the deep sea diver has made itself present in some of our work earlier and some of our writing, began to coalesce around this idea of the thought that requires you to dive and the thoughts that arise when you dive. So over the last year, and that's why we wanted to begin with something that's been very current in our practice, we began working on a series of moves that connected diving and thinking. The other things that came out of the shipwreck or were salvaged from the shipwreck was a cup, a drinking cup, on which was written a word in Greek called Pamphilos, which means the friend of all. So was Pamphilos the name of a person? Was it a attitude or a disposition that happens when you share a drink with other people? I mean, you get to be friendly. Is that what it was? what do people do when they sit together and drink? We went back to the idea of symposia, where the early Greek thinkers and philosophers did their philosophy either while walking or while sitting and drinking together. And that's what a symposium is. It's a drinking party. So if you look at Plato's Symposium, the famous dialogue on love, it actually begins with a set of tall tales told by people while getting drunk. So these kind of ideas began to make themselves present to us. We began thinking about the craft or intelligence required to navigate turbulent waters, and came across the figure of a minor goddess called Metis, and from which we get the word métier, or and she becomes the sort of spirit of.
Metis is an interesting figure. She was a goddess. The story goes that so she's a goddess, as Shraddha was saying. How, if you are trying to navigate the sea, how do you? You can't fight the ocean, right? It's just too big, too vast. Different technologies are imagined, different methodologies are imagined. As we know from the Melanesian part of the world, there was a concept of live reckoning, so which is why people from the islands were able to travel so far and on very small craft without knowing, because they had a very specific, they were able to find a relationship between their movement and the world's movement, and that is how the Pacific Ocean in its vastness was moved on. So this kind of knowledge, the knowledge of small things, small knowledges if we can call them, that which help you negotiate, which help you make sense of things so that you can you can come across really vast things, but you still find a way, because you can't fight them, you find a way through them, with them, along, that kind of knowledge. She was a goddess of small knowledges. So the story goes that she was, I can't remember now to be honest, what happened between her and Zeus, the big
Sky god.
The big sky god, the sort of the leader of my daughter probably remembers better than I do. But
Wife of Zeus, mother of Athena.
no, so but she was swallowed by him. She was eaten up by him. What I can't remember is what, but she was eaten up by him. And actually, what emerges then later from his head is Athena, the goddess of wisdom. Now, it's very interesting to us that what happens when power, as we can look at King Zeus, swallows the goddess of small knowledges, which helps you deal with the everyday, in order to produce, in an immaculate conception, a wisdom which is transcendental in a sense, because Pallas Athena becomes the wise, the goddess who has no birth, but who is. So in a way, it's also this great, if you just, in terms of just the way you could think it, a relationship between power, small knowledge, and what can be considered big wisdom, and that which you have to look towards for guiding you. In the big, and all the big stories are full of Athena and her decisions and what she often changed. But what is very interesting is that when we came across her, we began to look for images of her, and we found in all of this just one drawing. Like there's literally one drawing of Metis, a two-dimensional drawing which is on a vase. And in our search of asking other archaeologists and looking around, we found no other. So what we decided to do is to bring back a lost goddess, like bring back the goddess of small knowledges. And here is Metis, 3D printed using technology. We worked with a fabricator lab to imagine how to take a two-dimensional drawing into a three-dimensional drawing, and made her into this translucent figure who refracts light. If you put black light on her, she glows. If you put red light on her, she becomes. It's a very interesting material, this resin, so that it becomes both part of the ambience it is in, but also able to reflect back and create another kind of. So here, she looks, because of the difference of light, she's a mutating figure who exists and yet allows for things to pass through and reflect back.
All of which to say that these were responses that emerged to an invitation to continue thinking on the question of the commons. There was an invitation from an organization in Greece in the wake of the social, political, and economic upheaval in Athens, and Athens and Greek cities becoming symptomatic of the kind of crises in the global economy. One of the things that happened was that ordinary people, tried to reconstitute social and economic life.
Not tried to, they did.
They did reconstitute.
In different ways, in different places.
And this tied into a much earlier interest of ours, which had to do with thinking about what are the resources that people can generate commonly between themselves, ranging from open source and free software to forms of open learning, to forms of collaborative practice, to other forms of sort of transgressive and non-transgressive dialogic practices that bring together lots of people to create and sustain and nurture a continuing commons. So our work then, this particular work, which is called Pamphilos, became an overarching set of moves in which there was conversation, there was a drinking party, or regular drinking parties, there would be an immersive space, a beacon of light that moved, a lighthouse, the goddess of small knowledge, and also a kind of submarine performance, if you like, by 3 deep sea divers who found a phrase that we sort of borrowed from the work of a philosopher, and placed at the bottom of the sea, called the forgetting of the air. And all of this becomes a kind of context for a set of regular conversations which various kinds of people that we met in our journeys in Athens assembled to have. They could be a pharmacist who is running a kind of space where people can be healed who are outside the formal medical system. It could be philosophers. It could be people thinking about new political theories to do with the commons. It could be a psychoanalyst working with mental distress and psychological distress. And it could also be deep sea divers and poets. Poets who are exiles. For instance, there's a large community of Iranian and Kurdish people in Athens who in their common speech invoke a lot of poetry, and we met some remarkable poets. And also people who reconstitute, like we were saying, everything to do with the normal everyday processes of living.
Yeah, I mean, part of this was, these are the Pamphilos cups that were also made in which people drank wine while the conversations were happening. So there's a little funny story that happens as well, is that when the work was first installed, it was installed in the house of Maria Callas. Many people know her incredible voice, and she used to live in that house when she was young. Now, the house was then passed on. It became unused for many years. It was squatted for a number of years, became a social center, then that stopped as well, and then it was empty. So we loved the idea of installing the work in that house, and we did it. We installed the work, all of it. We spent weeks. If there was electricity, had to be, things had to be brought in, and all sorts of recuperation had to be done because the building hadn't been open for, 10 years or something. And after all of that, 2 days after the opening, they said, oh, by the way, you can't have the show anymore over here because there's an electric hazard, so you've got to get out. We're like, what the hell? We just finished doing this. We just had one conversation. And the joke between us is that, so the foundation that invited us is the Onassis Foundation. I don't know if those who know, but Maria Callas was dumped by Aristotle Onassis for Jackie Kennedy. So we were like, she's finally had her revenge. We were checked out, and we had to go to conservatories, which is why you see to the Odeon Conservatory, and that's where to reinstall and reimagine the piece in like 2 days. But this is why you can see the lighthouse both in a completely different space as well as inside the house of Maria Callas. And this is in the new context that it was, so everything, it's like the same work, but it was redone. And it's also interesting when you have to sort of think on what constitutes a work. And I think what was interesting about the new location of the work was the reason that we had begun to think of the shipwreck was not only because it's an incredible shipwreck with lots of interesting objects that emerged from it. It is because we have been thinking on the question of submarine horizon. Now, horizon is a word and a metaphor that we all recognize and appreciate, right? It gives us something to look towards. It gives us, for just in the language of the human, I think the word horizon is used so often because of the sense of moreness that it offers you. But when you're underwater, there is what is the horizon when you are in a changed environment, right? What do you constitute as a horizon when you cannot find a horizon that is given to you? So when you're deep underwater, there is no near, there is no far. Those categories start to change. When you're really in the deep blue, you don't know what is near and what is far. And so we've been thinking on the question of what we call the submarine horizon. You trying to understand it both, primarily as a kind of heuristic, as a method, as an engine, to try and imagine what is it and how is it that we can think of our world, how we inhabit it, how we co-inhabit it, how we live in it together, when we don't have, when the terms that we think we have are not the terms we have. When we do not have the horizon we think we have been given, when we have to reimagine the question of horizon, what is it that emerges then? And I think the question of looking for the broken philosopher underwater became really an interesting kind of, like, what do you join together? What do you constitute? What do you reconstitute? The sea is something we share, but we only recognize the importance of air when we are underwater, right? These are the things that we were sort of trying to bring together, and there was a moment when someone, I can't remember the text, but someone wrote saying it's like the philosophy of the everyday. I can't remember anyway. If I find it, I will bring it back to you. But this is how, so in a way, when we reinstalled it outside Maria Callas' house in this large conservatory space, it felt much more actually that it was liberated from that specific structure, the scaffolding of the house, and it became much more of an immersive experience. And it's an interesting thing as an artist, or not only as an artist, but I think when you take the question of literality and metaphor, and how far and close can you play with them? What happens when you take something to its literal kind of push? I think a lot of artists do that to try and understand what a metaphor, like, is a metaphor only words? Does it attain another state? What is it that changes when you know something and at the same time cannot put it in words? All of these kind of questions that the metaphor invokes, and yet we have to find forms of expression for them. So this is one of the conversations that is being held. We had 5 of these, as we said, with everyone drinking Pankilas wine. But from one conversation to another.
But just before we get there, I mean, I think this is a good kind of starting point, or an unraveling point, because it brings together a lot of things that we could say that are part of the method that we've sort of grown with over the past several years. One is the idea that the moving image is something that you can think with. That the image, actually making the image, makes you think something more. It also creates new worlds. So for us, this idea of let's see what happens if we start filming with deep sea divers deep under the ocean. What new world will open itself to us? Let's see what happens if we push the idea of the commons onto the commons of the abandoned, the shipwrecked, the relics of the past. What can it tell us about the future of our lives? What can it do if we push the metaphor of the shipwreck of everyday life? let's see what happens if we take the conversational practice and take it to somewhere else in the presence of a mythical figure. So all of these kind of little moves that one makes in thinking, in dialogue, in conversation can be realized. And I think that in our working method, this is the means by which the triangulation of our sensibilities, our minds, our dispositions, our obsessions, our curiosities get embodied in concrete instances where new works emerge from this kind of jostling of things that are going on in our minds. Which brings us to another kind of conversation, a conversation between human beings and their own creations, between our human essences, for whatever worth one can talk about them, and technologies, between labor of one kind and labor of another kind, between, let's say, what we call living labor, what is dead labor, which is one of the definitions of capital, is that it is dead labor, and a term that we came up with half whimsically, half jokingly, but also in earnest in our conversation, ghost labor. So just as the deep sea diver is a figure that repeats itself in our work, in our thinking, another figure that's beginning to make itself present is the figure of the robot, or the automaton, or the androids of different kinds, of the relationship between flesh and prosthesis, or conversely the relationship between human flesh and other forms of animal life. So if you take the spectrum of animal life, humanity, and post-humanity as a continuum, not as a set of distinctions, but as a kind of spectrum in which we move as individuals, as human beings, every day. You know, we move between being animals who are hungry, between humans who have conversation, and between machines that are also doing processes in the background of our lives. And so this became a little conversation. It is staged as a little dramatic dialogue, but takes the form in this case of a kind of manga-like object, a short graphic novel, if you like, a novella, graphic novel.
Yeah, I should have brought more pictures, but anyway. Do you want to come in, Jivesh, from the audience? Speak a little bit about the...
He's being the post-human.
So I don't know if I can find necessarily a direct trace, but I think perhaps moving on to this...
Energy is the trace.
Well, energy, but I was also thinking about the relation with storytelling itself, which is, this piece is a long film. Thinking with images was, as Shraddha was saying, has been part of the practice. So and I think this could be connected to the prosthetic of the machine, which is the camera, but when one is thinking about the sense of duration of time and one is taking video, there is a difference, for example, than taking an image, a photographic image. And this is what happens when you start to see what the human-machine relationship can develop. But thinking with images was also, during this process of making this film, called Provision for Everyday Life, was also thinking on the question of how stories get told about, as he said, about energy as one thing. We are living in a time where the Anthropocene is a word that is used to describe this this landscape that we are part of now, right? The question of energy, we were in Philippines, we actually went and saw a nuclear power plant that was made but never commissioned. And it remains a hope in that area that maybe one day it will be commissioned. The hunger for power, for energy, is something that humans embody, live with, make, work with, need. So this film was trying to think through this question of what is fuel, what burns, how do we think about what burns? Is it human? Is it outside the human? What is the relationship between those things? But I did all of this by thinking through the text, through George Orwell. George Orwell has written stories that we are quite familiar with, such as Animal Farm in 1984. But he also wrote a book called The Road to Wigan Pier, which is one of the earlier books, which is about the coal mining industry in England, in the north of England. And coal, one of the most important sources of energy even today. It's a landscape now, if you go to the north of England, completely denuded from that. We all know about the Thatcherite era and the sort of the shutting down of the coal mines and what it has transformed the north of England into. But we did travel, we used the idea of the road to Wigan Pier and a sense of accompanying him on a journey, as it were, a road film, where we also went to where George Orwell was born, which is in northeast India, in East India, in a small town where there's a very small house where his father used to be the storekeeper of the
Opium godown.
Yeah, of the godown, which stored opium and indigo, which is what the British were extracting from that part of India and exporting. And it's a house that has nothing in it except 2 plastic chairs and which you can see actually, and a portrait of George Orwell at the back. That's all that it has, and it has 3 or 4 tiny little rooms, and it's interesting because that was almost 100 years ago when he was born, and yet it feels so empty.
But coincidentally, it's also very close to an ancient Buddhist site where the Buddha is supposed to have given one of his most significant sermons, which is called the Charter of Doubt, where he told an assembly, don't believe anything I'm telling you. You have to figure it out for yourself. And you have to apply the mode of critical, skeptical questioning towards all claims to truth and all claims to power. It doesn't matter whether the person presents themselves as learned, whether they come from a great lineage, whether they make an appeal to your emotions. All claims to truth must be tested against the rock of experience. And this charter, or this celebration of doubt as a mode of life, seemed to us to resonate very well with Orwell's skepticism of grand narratives. At the same time, Road to Wigan Pier is a kind of, let's say, a eulogy or a lament, both a eulogy and a lament for coal and coal mining. And Orwell is obsessed with how much energy is produced by coal. How much does a coal miner make in terms of energy, right? The calculation of figures. And also, how much does a coal miner get to eat? What is the relationship between the calorific value of a coal miner's daily diet and the calorific value of the coal that he's producing? One of the Buddha's enigmatic statements is Sabba Aditya, which means everything is burning. And it's the beginning of what is called the fire sermon. And it basically says everything is burning. We're all made up of combustible substances. And so this seemed to us to present an opportunity for conducting this kind of post-mortem conversation between the Buddha and George Orwell, refracted through the burning of coal and the thinking about energy in politics. So we'll play a little fragment where we will have pigs as well as coal.
1984 and the Road to
And
Wigan
Animal
Pier.
Farm.
I mean, Animal Farm and the Road to
This is in the house in which he was born.
Down, yeah. So interestingly, the second part of what you just saw, that road that goes, is shot in Burma, in Naypyidaw, which is this capital of Burma that was literally invented overnight. The reason for going to Burma to shoot is also because George Orwell was there as a member of the police force of the empire. So that was part of the empire at that time. And the reason what is really interesting about his time there is it's a short story that he wrote, or a memoir, called Shooting the Elephant. Shooting the Elephant is very short, and it's worth reading if you get a minute, where basically he is the person in charge, he's the head in that part of Burma then Burma, where one day an elephant has gone rogue. It has killed a peasant or two, and the village people come to him and they ask him to kill the elephant. And what then you read is the anxiety of someone who is in a position of power, who does not know how to fulfill the expectations of being in power, does not really wish to kill the elephant. He seems like a magnificent beast, and yet when you are in that position of power, you have to. So and of course this road that you keep driving on is a road that has been built right by the parliament in Naypyidaw. And you wonder why. It's like this massive 10-lane highway where there's hardly any traffic, and it just goes on, and you wonder why. And the rumor goes that it is for in case those in power need to run away. So this question, I think, and so for us it became this question of also thinking through what burns is not only a relationship between the human body and what it burns up, or what it burns of itself in order to produce and reproduce in systems of capital, but also relationship with power in that sense of what is it that what is constructed to maintain certain systems, and what is it that gets burned in the maintenance or falling apart of those systems.
I must say, this is the first time I've done a talk with Raqs where we're drinking beer, and it's very nice. I think that all artist talks should have provision for the speakers to drink while they're talking. It makes for very lucid thinking. So much so that it makes it possible for us to make this jump between energy and matter, which is part of the way the universe gears itself. So while coal and energy and fire is very much a concern of the provisions for every day, we began thinking a lot about matter itself and what makes our bodies, the earth, and the stars, and how they connect. So there is a little bit of a fragment that we want to talk about of a work called The Blood of Stars, which is a meditation on iron and its presence in the earth, on what iron does, whether we have ever left the Iron Age, whether iron as a means of producing weapons or implements or wars does things to our ways of being human, and the fact that iron is the binding structure that allows for life and death, both for the boundaries of cellular structure as well as the processes of oxidation that eventually lead to cell death, and that our blood is iron. So The Blood of Stars is a work that rose as the response to another invitation to think about a very different ecology, the far north of the Arctic Circle and what is present there. And we found that one of the things that are present in the Arctic Circle are actually iron mines. So these are pictures from our research notes: the steel refinery, meteorites, iron objects, investigations into iron mining, thinking about the transformation of the ecology of the Arctic Circle, about how mines produce dams which raise the levels of streams, which inhibit reindeer from walking over their territories, all sorts of things that became and part of thinking about a story that could be told under the ground, like between, we started by talking about subterranean submarine metaphors. And this is a work that finally found its home inside a complex of tunnels inside a mountain, so under the ground, literally.
What is it, one of the joys of thinking on the world is that one is thinking on the world, but how is that one giving it form? And what was really enjoyable in the making of this work, besides thinking on blood and looking at the slaughter of reindeers, which is part of the natural cycle of things. So it's not in any kind of recoil, but just to see the kind of connection that flows. But what was also very interesting was when we think of cinema, we think of ourselves sitting and the scenes on the film are moving. So we decided to go and see what happens if you do it the other way around. Like what happens if you think of you moving and seeing different
Scenes.
So it became a work which was actually a walk in 10 scenes. Each scene rendered different things to you. Each scene asked you to sort of connect to the other scenes that you will see or would have seen, to the soundtrack that accompany things, the specific acoustics of that place, of course. But and how stories, of course, if you chose one path, you read the story in one way, which now in gaming it seems like this thing. But if you went another way, you paid. The question of emphasis is all that changed. But it left also a lot more is in terms of narrative building itself, in terms of what. Which is also the interesting thing about site-specific work, is that it has its own affect. So work has its affect, but a site has its own affect. And I think even white cubes actually have their own affect. I don't think a white cube in Manila is the same as a white cube even in another city. It's not, or in Delhi, for example, because there is something outside the white cube too. So this idea that things exist only within that white cube is fallacious as far as I'm concerned, because it seems to imply that the boundary is not porous. When we've written a whole book called Seepage, so we believe strongly in the idea that structures change because of what seeps through. It is what creates. You will get probably fungus and mold and have delusions and has hallucinations, but you will also have a completely changed structure because of the fact of seepage. There is porosity. And so a site, of course, is especially redolent of what it comes with. It comes with smell and sound and acoustics, and in this case, a history of always the fear of war, because these tunnels were made to be military barracks and a war room in case there was a war with Russia, which was just across the
nuclear war.
A nuclear war. So what was really interesting to find in one of the empty drawers, in one of the empty rooms, which still had the stuff from 1970s, 50s, 60s. Yes. So you had these barracks and you had furniture and you had this kind of switchboard machines. Everything had just been left. But in one of the drawers, one found also a booklet of the death report. So what is it that would be filled and signed for every death?
For casualties.
Casualties. So it was the casualness of all of this. But now it has been sold to someone who basically grows. I don't know if you can tell. It's really humid and it maintains an even temperature. Even when it's minus 15, it's still 4 degrees inside. Even when it's plus 20, it's 4 degrees inside, or something like that. So basically, you can grow, and it's really. And there was a picture of mushrooms, so you can see that these are the mushrooms that grow inside the tunnel. So it's very interesting, sort of living, and of course mold and fungi. There are special kinds of fungi that can actually eat star matter, right?
Meteorites.
Meteorites. So the relationship between what you chance upon and what you're thinking on is always one of the sort of parts of the process, which is why I wanted to show you pictures actually of the research, of the images that we were taking as we were walking through without knowing, the first contact moment of when you haven't begun to think. Well, you are thinking, you just don't know it yet. And you start to take images because images help you to focus your attention, images help you to have a memory, images help you in a way that words do differently. So which is why these are the pictures of the darkness of the tunnels. The camera can't cope. So it also became, in a way, it also became making a work which was a walk in which you had to experience the entirety, the darkness, the hollowness, the leftover, the remnants. All of these things was also about being able to find that out for yourself as a member of the public, and not only being told that this, like, the artwork existed in moments, but the rest of the experience was yours to take back as much.
So there's a kind of investigation or excavation that happens in many of these projects. So you walk into the archives of a military barracks, you look at documents, you find things. In the previous project, one of the things that we found and we were able to actually borrow and show as a part of the installation was a fragment of a meteorite which was incredibly heavy, but which was 500 million years older than the Earth. And it carried with it part of the iron that is distributed over the northern Arctic regions of Sweden. Which
but
is
also,
why,
in that sense, iron, no? That line we
Yeah.
are all going to start. This is because all the iron on the planet is supposed to have come from
outside,
not from
stars.
Earth. So, in a sense, all the life that we are also comes directly from.
Including all the iron in our blood. So there's this apocryphal statement that we found by an astrophysicist which said that all the iron, astrobiologist, that all the iron in your left, all the blood in your left arm comes from one star, and all the blood in your right arm comes from another star, whatever that means, right?
Yeah.
But it's this process of excavation, investigation that yields then new possibilities of thinking. So similarly, so just as you think about blood, you think about bread and biscuits, you think about things that you ingest. And so in an archive, while doing other things, while looking for other traces, we found a biscuit. And
Which
this
it
is
says on itself, biscuit.
biscuit. It's a biscuit from the days of the Commune of Paris, from the Paris Commune, when the Amalgamated Federation of the Bakers of Paris, amongst many federations that constituted the Paris Commune, decided to produce free and openly distributed biscuits for the population. This biscuit of the Paris Commune is a substance that you could think of ingesting, just as one ingests the communion wafer. Right? I mean, it connects you to the body and blood of a moment in time, this moment in time, or a presence. So we thought that it might be interesting to think about cloning this biscuit and making it a part of a work. So what we did was to actually do a work with a person who specializes in 3D printing of difficult objects, and produced a 3D print version of a mold for this biscuit,
And then biscuits were
and
baked.
then baked used the mold to bake biscuits that could then be a part of the exhibition that it was
could also
talking
eat.
about, but which you could also eat in the cafe or the restaurant of the site where the exhibition was taking
How
place.
does it taste? Is it edible?
Well, we didn't get permission to eat the original biscuit,
Yeah.
but the biscuit or this is
The
something.
replica biscuit was
Yeah, because it's hardtack, which is also what sailors used to carry on ships. It's basically flour, salt, and water, and
edible
baked.
charcoal.
In this case, in order to sort of make the facsimile experience of the biscuit, we added edible charcoal to it so that it looked like the black biscuit that we found in the archive. And in every other way, it is an exact replica. And it became also interesting, like, this question of what is it that you ingest and what do you, I mean, we've talked about the question of calorific, value and energy, and but also but to ask the question of ingesting a relationship with a moment in history. And I mean, it all comes together in our talks really, where the commune or the communal or the collective had a moment of becoming which we know was crushed, but at the same time remains in collective memory as that incredible point in the history of modern post-industrial life. So it became also this question of what happens to me when I taste a biscuit or when I eat a biscuit that is connected to that moment. It has so little to do with the taste, and it has so much to do with the taste. So when it was, this is one of the, but anyway. I think this could show the thing. Was that the 10 minute or last minute?
Yeah.
Well, I think we might end with the last couple of things. As we said, things connect, but I will find a way to connect this, or probably you will help me connect this to the rest of the things that I've been talking about. It's just something I wanted to share with you, because we have been talking about ghosts and ghost labor in a very different way. But this is the simple, formal, joyous pleasure of making a ghost of a building. We were we were taken to the northwest of Japan, in the Okunoto Peninsula, where, like a lot of rural Japan, lots and lots of people have moved on to the big cities of to Tokyo metropolitan area, for example, and so on. So there's hardly anyone left. And there used to be this train line that ran up the peninsula, which is now no longer working because even no one uses that. They're farmers and they're mostly older people and so on. But we were, actually, I don't know, you cannot see this so well, but this is an old railway station which used to be connecting just up and down the peninsula, and where the paddy fields are is where the tracks used to run. And so we began to think of the question of what is it that gets left behind when things come to an end, right? What is it that, we've talked, in terms of just like iron is the result of what gets left behind when meteorites strike the earth, and we have life. So there is always something that emerges from something which may have a different past from the one that we imagined, and a different past might lead to a different future that we may not yet think of. And so these things are always, and we wanted to just open this idea out in terms of and so we found a Japanese word because we couldn't, which is utsushimi, which is both that sense of exhalation, like when you breathe out. And I find this thing between inhalation and exhalation, again, it's one of those ineffable things, like the forgetting of air question. You breathe, and all the time, what is it that you expel? The body is constantly working. The body is constantly burning up, really, and doing things. And what is it that gets exhaled is something we don't, we pay attention to for different reasons, usually not for the ones that are, or maybe in my case, very rarely, unless I'm underwater. But this is, for us, an exhalation of the building itself. It is the exact form of the building, of this structure. And it's really quite extraordinary because as the night falls, the sensors just put on the lights, which are reflecting off paint. So it is just basically made of lines of steel which start to glow, and it's not neon. So it doesn't actually have that light of creating a new night, of creating day at night, which is what neon often does, which is what we like urban landscape. It has an experience very difficult to share because it's not, maybe I should try and find a video sometime, but it's a quality of, I felt like a moth to flame in the sense that it's very hypnotic. So it feels like something which is ghostly, like a ghostly haunting. And it seemed interesting to us to think of a ghostly haunting of the structure itself.
Of abandoned railway infrastructure.
Yeah, but in the sense not necessarily of like, oh, this is such a sad thing, but just that everything has its own exhalation, right? It has, and things that are not living have a different, or maybe have an exhalation too, and how does one try and find to give a form to them?
Yeah, I think that might be a good point to stop and think.
Okay, just
another ghost.
Another ghost. So we'll end with ghosts. Another ghost in another form. This is a sculpture actually, which is at the V&A.
And it's also an android. It's an early.
It's an automaton.
It's an automaton. Yeah.
It's a tiger which was commissioned by Tipu Sultan a sort of sultan is a big word, but he was a king of a principality in South India who was fighting the British, and he commissioned this automaton, which when wound up, it has, you can see the organ, when you wound it up, it made these growling noises, and it was as if it was eating away at the body of the British soldier who was the red coat, whom you can see lying underneath it. And and it's actually quite a prized possession of, you can YouTube it and you can hear it, quite a prized possession of the V&A. So when we were invited to, by the V&A, actually by the Goethe Institute in England, in London, and the V&A to do something at the V&A.
To think about the future of Europe.
What they wanted us to think about was, what do you look back on
2,000 years in the future.
4,000 years. It was like thousands of years in the future. If you were to look back at Europe, how would you look back at Europe from the future? So this question of ghosts and futures and pasts comes back again over here. And so we said it was a performance which had two screens, in which one on one side, one on the other, and you could choose to sit on either side or move in between, because there were two different things were going on. And these two reading performances were basically as if we were looking back as if the only thing that was left behind from all of this was Tipu's tiger. As if Europe, how could you read Europe through Tipu's tiger? But what it became actually was not just, and we invented words, and it was actually quite funny and interested in a number of, which I will not get into, but the only point I wanted to make was, it did end by ruminating on the question of our relationship with the machine, when we had given up moral agency by using the machine as our stand-in. The drone, the drone that will bomb Afghanistan, but the person who's the pilot who's piloting, joysticking with the machine like so far away. That sense of, because you've given up I don't have to feel guilty anymore. It's not the automaton, I have passed on my moral agency. I have
outsourced it.
I have outsourced it. I am absolved of the question of responsibility, what I do to another, because I have the machine now in the middle. So for us, the machine is both at the center of how we work, because so much of it uses technology. We work with computers and with cameras and with all of those kind of, we don't game, as you well know. But at the same time, what happens when you stop acknowledging that relationship is or if you change the status of that relationship, in which you start to give up your own moral responsibility and you pass it on to the machine. And that is what it, anyway, that's what we were. It's not working. It's not the film. Oops. Yeah. Anyway, so I will leave you with that question of ghosts and machines who are, Anyway, Jibesh, you want to say a few words to say something at the end? It's okay. Yeah, there's a film, but right now it's not working. Yeah, so it's a lecture performance that has many things happening on both screens, like I said. But in this, I thought I put in a video, but actually I just put in a still. So sorry about that. But anyway, this is supposed to be a conversation, so I'm hoping that it is going to be a conversation. Thank you.
So you've been working for 27 years, and the art world knows you. And power seems to be one of the heart of your concerns. I just want to know how you dealt with your own power.
With our own
your own power, the power that you gained. Because we're talking about energies and water consumed and expended, and what you have gained. And you have gained power in the art world. I just want to know what your thinking and diving is about in terms of your own power as artists, curators.
Yeah, now powerless day.
Before Jivesh answers that question, I want to say
I've
outsourced my answer. I want to say that almost 23 years ago, we once had a conversation in which I had said, we will have to think about our power one day. At that time, he said, we will never have power. And I said, that's not a choice that we can make.
You're not innocent of it, right?
No, of course not. And I think this is a really important question.
I'm going to get
The question of how one navigates the everyday in relationship to those with whom, what you're exactly pointing out. And I think this has been part of the process of how. The problem with a question like this is anything I say is going to sound defensive, which I want to always begin by saying, let's not go there. Let's not think in terms of that. What we have found, I personally, and I think that this might be interesting for all of us to think aloud on, is the metaphor I began to think of was many years ago is when you chuck for myself, is when you chuck a stone in the pond, then what happens is the ripples. And what is interesting is not just to see where the stone falls, but how many ripples you can get out of it and what is it that it leads to. And I say this especially in the context of because we began a place called Sarai, which was in 2000 and 2001, when we had invented a space called Sarai with academics and then very soon we were involving people from the open source community, we were involving people from research and also from the Cyber Mohalla ensemble, and so there was an expanding community of people that were associated with Sarai in different forms. Books were done, conferences were done, research was done. And Sarai was very much for me, that's where I thought of this idea, not so much in the context of what you're asking, but simply the fact of how does one create situations where one doesn't know what's going to happen, and yet one creates the potential of things happening that one doesn't know about. Starting Sarai was an example of that. When we were beginning it, people said there's no one going to be coming, it's never been, the usual suspect kind of but we were of the opinion that if you try something, if you begin something, then publics find you find publics, and so on. And I think I would still kind of hold to that in some of the things that we do. And whether it's at this point of time right now in Delhi, we are running, we catalysts, we call ourselves, of a process called 5 million incidents, which we are doing where we're asking the question of occupation of time and forms of the artistic in which anyone who can, it's a public call, it comes in layers. There's a whole methodology for it. It has participants and mentors and custodians and catalysts that we are. All of these again is the same sort of ethos of you don't know, you try it, something will happen from that. We've done that with Sarai Reader 9, which was an exhibition that lasted 9 months in Delhi, in a space that has since. There are lots of stories like this. What one does with all, and I think that's pretty much the only extent I mean, in some ways, getting a new commission, being asked to make some work, for me is still a exciting opportunity in the sense that when I get someone says to me from Athens, would you like to think on making something? And then you're like, yes, I'm as excited by it as I might have been, you spend a year of your life engaging with that. The fact that it comes to you is possibly from that, possibly not.
I can just have to take a minute.
Why not?
Okay.
Take the power.
I think power. I was in a seminar in Calcutta in August last. So the last document artistic director was there, Adam Chintu, and there was this discussion about that they have gone over budget by $1 million. And
This is the two-side finale.
yeah. So and what was interesting was how defensive Adam was to this, and what was and because the idea that artistic director is a very powerful position, documenter is an institutional power. So I was saying that compare the budget of documenter, which was working with 300 artists from all over the world as the only platform, and compare its budget to a one airplane or one fighter plane. It is one fighter plane is about $100 million. The documenter was over budget by 1 million, and it has spent 41 million. So I was saying that power, the kind of actually we have very little power, not in the sense that we need more discursive power. I think art world needs to, as artists, we need to argue for much more discursive power. Rather than the material kind of material name power. You know that when we talk about power, the ability to transform a landscape of the discursive presence, which I think artists need much more, and they have very little. So I would ask for an argument for more power.
But for discursive power.
That to translate it into a discursive power, to have that guilt-free discursive power.
I think by this, Jibish is also sort of saying that, that whole, if you look at the figures of the art world, the numbers, they might seem very large, but if in relationship to other cultural forms, they are really quite small.
No, that is the monetary part.
Yeah, so there's that one monetary aspect.
The monetary aspect of it, art world is inconsequential in the global economy. It's not even close to anything. Hollywood is 78 billion, 78 billion economy. Art world is not even a 15 billion economy. All over the world, it's nothing.
Why is that?
No, because art world.
This is what he's talking about.
That's what I'm saying. The power in art world has to be claimed as a discursive power.
So you want to make an equation of film in Hollywood costs this much?
No, not an equation. I'm saying the present, the question of power has to be brought into a relational field. Of what kind of power are we talking about?
But let me add a spanner in the works. Because we have been thinking so much about energy in the last few years, I'm also acutely conscious of the fact that all forms of power are forms of radiating energy, and they dissipate over time. Power weakens. And so there's a whole work that we did called Coronation Park, that's one of the slides. It's looking at the conceit of the idea that power has an eternal presence. So there's a park, there's a kind of dumping ground of the relics of colonial and imperial power in Delhi called Coronation Park, where the statues of former viceroys and kings and so on are now placed in retirement. And it's not just a question of the end of colonial power. That place itself, to us, seems to be like a metaphor or a signifier of the short lifespan of all forms of power.
You say false power?
No,
Forms of power.
Short lifespan of all forms of power. Now, I mean, there is a time in the career of certain kinds of politicians where they want to make a mark on the landscape. Like in the Batan, this Mount Samat Memorial is this great cross, right? Marcos wanted to mark the mountain. In India right now, we have a man who's decided to build the largest statue in the world. Someday it will fall. It's bound to fall. It cannot stay vertical forever because of the nature of what time does to structure. So if one thinks of all power as forms of structure, then it is possible to argue that the performance that power makes, if power is a form of performance, is that it will never fall. But all forms of power fall. And I think that is an inbuilt caveat that we propose all the time to thinking about even forms of discursive power. Yes, artists should claim greater forms of discursive power or greater magnitudes of discursive power, fully aware that what they are saying now will one day be interesting but irrelevant.
That's bullshit.
Okay.
You can't function like that.
You can't.
You can't function like that.
Your irrelevance cannot be of operation of your own thought.
No, it cannot be. It cannot be the operational principle of your own thought. No. But nor can the claim that your thought has irrelevance for all eternity.
But then only.
Why are you bringing relevance?
And in the context of irrelevance, in a world where, as it is, you're considered quite marginal already in so many ways as an artistic then the question of irrelevance is always in relational, I don't know to what. So the question of irrelevance is really the argument that is I think the question. See, this what I do find interesting is this relationship between verticality and horizontality, right? What does power do in context of horizontality and so the big sculptures and the big whatever, and we have enough display of that kind of power too in the art world and so on. Of course, I mean, and that's why the question of horizontality, I think, how one thinks about things permeating, creating more porosities, opening up more rhizomatic connections. This is for me what power can, and I'm being very like pragmatic in the sense of answering your question quite straightforward, is that but the question is, even as one does that, you cannot take away from the fact that simultaneously you have to stop considering both yourself and your practices marginal, right?
No.
No, that's what I'm saying. And so how does one take this, whatever one has, in order to push possibilities into a louder tonality that acknowledges both horizontality and possible audiences, right? This is for me an interesting possibility.
Isn't it part of our argument always that we have to think of the geometry outside the question of the periphery and the center? Outside the question of the margin and the center?
Then irrelevance is a pointless argument.
Okay, irrelevance is the wrong.
Horizontal also a common terms. Now what would be another term that's not horizontal or vertical?
Tangential.
Tangential. I would like to bring back the goddess of small things. I think just to make the loop, we go back to the goddess who's buried and she's the goddess of métier, did you say?
Metis, yeah, small knowledges.
Small knowledges. So
small intelligences.
The small, I think, is the key discussion here too, rather than the big, it's just that vertical big.
Exactly.
But I guess even the right is always to do with small, right? The movement,
something that moves fast, something that moves.
It's quick and speedy, which brings me to again another machine that you're going to work with and are working with right now, which is the machinery of the binale or the trenale, because that's a big machine. I was just interested because the press that I read was you found an anthropologist who was working with a laborer who understood Felix Cotteri and
So this is a good story. What we're interested in, and this is something that we've been discussing also in the last couple of days a little bit, is the question of source, right? Now, narratives come. No narrative starts on its own. It always pulls from. This is the story of how stories get made. The question is, what is it that you're pulling from? So what we have become to talk aloud about is what are our sources and how many more can we bring into and from where? From where, from what vantage point, what does it speak of, and how can we bring them together in order that something which is not narrated from a certain vantage point has a possible, like I said, a louder tonality or a possible tonality. So in the context, and this we were working on, especially in the last exhibition that we were curating, which was in a museum at MACBA in Barcelona, called In the Open or in Stealth. And that things will happen, sometimes they will happen in the open, sometimes they will happen in stealth. But things are always happening. And what all was happening, there were a number of things that we were, and there we actually sort of brought 10, 15 and we make them part of the exhibition, all the sources.
Instead of themes, we said here are sources.
It's not instead of, it's just a different way of like trying to see. So the sources were as much a part of the exhibition as the works, not as works themselves, but as like a scroll that was made available to read. When we began to think about Yokohama, we said, let us also think through the question of sources again. Like, let us see what, it's not a public competition, but it is a competition. The triennial is inviting a number of people and you all have to give your proposal. It is very old school. You have to write a concept and you have to give it in. But what we wrote was, we said, what are the kind of sources that we can pull? One of the sources that we are looking at and which we are pulling from for its autodidactic quality is the book that you're referring. It is an anthropology book which was written in the 80s or the 90s?
2007.
2005.
But the field work was done.
Field work was done in the
90s.
very valid dates. in which this anthropologist, who is English, spends time and he meets this dock worker in Yokohama, who, while half the time is in a drunken stupor, but the other half the time when he's not in a drunken stupor, he actually is having very conversations because he has read a lot, so he can quote like mid-20th century literature, and he also reads philosophy, and he has his own life story. But what is interesting is the way that the book is written is the fact that this figure is a complete autodidact. He is willing to work only when he needs the money. He lives in daily payment houses, which are like rooms you can rent per day. They still exist. Now have become, anyway, long story, we will get into that. And he chooses to be an alcoholic, which is and when he's not drunk, then he's reading.
He's in a library, in a public library.
So for us, this question of the autodidact, which is something which again, if for Raqs has been very important. We pull our own, if we were to say what is our connection with our own, like how would we trace our history, we would say we are it's very strong for us. We do see ourselves as autodidacts, and for us, the fact that there's an autodidactic figure in the town which we have to go and spend time in was a very interesting one. But the other two are also important. The one which we began with as references, one is the book called Nujum al-Ulum, which is written in the 18th century, which is 16th century. Never trust me about dates. On the 16th century, which is a list of homilies and recipes and other such like collection of material, which is on the notion of care and wisdom.
Well, the word curator really comes from
caring. It does, indeed, absolutely. Curare, there's a poisonous element there, but the care is an important part of it. And we were strongly reminded of our friend Svetlana Boyan. She has passed away, to the sadness of everyone, including the possible books that she would have written, who spoke in an essay about the luminosity of friendship, especially between women, and she looks specifically at how women dynamics work in friendship in that context. But luminosity of friendship, right? And this is very interesting. What for us is interesting is luminosity, not enlightenment, if you will. Not coming from outside, but from within. And so luminosity and care. And the third source is a book written by a woman in the early 20th century who travels to Japan when she marries a farmer whom she falls in love with, who comes to Bengal. She falls in love with him in the early 20th century, very unexpected, and she goes to live with him and become the farmer's wife. And she writes her memoirs in Bengali. So it's also about making yourself do things that you are not ever
making yourself a
planning.
new person.
I just want to go back to the discussion about discourse, because at the end of it, what was that? I don't know if this is a popular well, but somebody said the way to make artists and biennales happy is to give them a great catalog where they are written about. So I was just wondering how you're going to handle the production of discourse in your biennale.
It's on our first view.
No, so the curatorial practice is a discursive practice. And the discursive practice which has within it an indiscipline. Its power lies in the indiscipline of the discursive practice that curatorial allows. It is inter, but it's indisciplined. It can actually toy with the 16th century text, and it can toy with the early 20th century, early 21st century text, and it can draw those links, not necessarily in the coherent disciplinary way.
So it's very interdiscursive.
Yeah, it is open to all. It has a heterogeneity inbuilt into it. So that what compels the way we see the space of the sources multiplying. So the artists multiply the possibility of the reading of the source rather than exploring just what they have been doing before. So they are contaminated by another source, and they contaminate us. But So what we are interested in is indisciplined contamination of production of a discursive framework, which then has the capacity to draw in multiple
Which brings
protagonists.
us back to the autodidact.
Yeah, autodidact and de-author. The curatorial practice in that sense is also de-authoring practice. So we are de-authoring ourselves as the process is unfolding. So in a sense it is a bit complicated in that it is not an authorial position. You are de-authoring yourself as the more and more artists are involved, more and more protagonists are involved. It is multi-sourcing itself, multiplying author, and you have, after some time, you do not have a control. But what it does is it opens up the field to all kinds of possible readings. That's how we see the discursive space. That is how we are proposing the discursive space for your conversation.
I like the way people I like things that decenter things.
Yeah. But curatorial practice power is the author. It's the discursive power is that it has to speak in the multitude.
I think that's also what you were implying when you were talking earlier about
The discursive power.
of discursive powers in this sense, where the idea of the
The multiple.
multitude having, or having
Presence.
a presence that cannot be even fit into categories. It creates its own domain of thought. It creates its own domain of affect. You cannot put it into a kind of ready-made of this or that, and that is the kind of propulsion that that discussion with power can also have.
Are they going to confine you to a space, or are you free to choose your space?
Well, we are thinking of modalities. Of course, there's a museum and there's another building nearby, but we are trying to think. I mean, once we wrote an essay called "Earthworms Dancing," Biennale in slow motion. So, which was some time ago, which was the question of how does one think of time in relationship to something like an event, which has its own eventness. What does one do with time? And that is why, for example, when we were doing Sarai Reader 9 as an exhibition, it was an exhibition for 9 months in which every day something was going to change. But here we're trying to understand also the, I cannot tell you because we have not, it's not ready to be public and we're still working it out. But we're trying to figure out the relationship between both exploding and bringing together as a sort of, if I can use this as a metaphor, things come out and they don't necessarily get contained about a location by a location. They're also about time and they're also about finding different locations. But it really is about how does one create eruptions which can then, the volcanic is such a great metaphor here.
The Pacific Ring of Fire.
I mean, it really
it's
is
not
like
only, the Mount Fujiyama is the northern edge of the Philippine Sea plate. So when something
Back to that
happens,
metaphor.
when something happens here, that something happens there. So as a model of thinking about space and time, one can think about a more distributed presence rather than a more concentrated.
Not necessarily geographically, possibly that, but also just as little eruptions that subside but leak into the next possibility. That's what we're thinking.
We're thinking of the time of the Biennale, that when we start now and talking, the Biennale
It's already
going to happen there. So how do you deliberate from the time you are beginning to the event? So that time, is it an empty time that will be filled up with an event? Or it is a time that has no quality and it has no density? So that is the question that we are trying to pursue.
How do we get what's happening here and there?
Yeah. And
Yes, exactly. And this texture also, this viscosity.
How we can prolong it, that time as sensible. Otherwise it is research, you do research, you do an event, and then there is the next.
These are like discrete objects there, that's it.
So this time that we are building about 17, 18, what is the quality of the time? That is one of the questions that we are trying to pursue. Can we make it legible?
In can we try at least to find some form to make that part of the experience of the triennial? I don't know about this.
You mentioned about chance, and I'm thinking about providence, gods, and things that come to you that seem to be chance, but actually not. It seems to be at the heart of the word.
Yeah, there's actually a word for the fact that when you learn a new word, it's amazing how, like, the next day you'll find it again, and the next day you'll find it again, and you think like,
What is
till
it? What is the word?
I don't know, I don't remember, but there's a thing for it. Like, there's a word for this situation where till yesterday I never knew the word, I never read it. Today I know it, and then I will keep finding it again and again. And I do think it is, whether it's chance or providence, or is it my capacity
You
for
have to be
awareness?
right for
It's like
chance.
the word has an energy in itself, and you seem to embody that energy through the word. I'm thinking the word has power. For their lack of
For the lack of
Power is
better-
a sense of a productivity. But this is true, like there are sometimes I feel personally that things have arrived to us in a very, very
At the right time, right
right
place.
time
Yeah.
to make sense of it.
Yes.
Because we have a work which is a first fingerprint for fingerprinting, which
Handprint.
In the archive we saw it in 1993. We made a work out of it in 2010 because up in 17 years we were ready for that. We were ready for that. Before that we were not ready. We were trying it out. We were doing things with it. We were thinking with it. But work never emerged. And that work finally emerged was just a 1 minute. And I think one of the
For all
finest.
of those times.
Yeah.
And which I think one of the finest.
But it's a 1 minute loop that is, which we claim is counting to infinity. So in a sense, not just for me also, it's
Just a minute.
it's a handprint has begun to count. It's the first handprint that has now begun to count the uncountable, which is the
We needed the
human.
digital to understand it, and then we animated it, made it count. So it is now counted.
Does this.
into infinity.
Infinity is just counting things.
Yeah, it's always counting.
So it took 17 years. Actually, somebody asked how much time did this work? It's 17 years. But actually, if you said how much time did the work take, it was 5 days of editing.
Yeah.
In that sense, it arrived to you, but you were not ready for it. The time was not ready. You didn't have the wherewithal to understand. But when it arrives and starts sipping it all over.
With that, sorry.
This is a very
Maybe we could open it up to
To other
anybody for
people,
just
yes.
one more question or comment.
please.
I really like the part where you mentioned that it was a shipwreck, and then you were talking about what makes up a work when you were transferring from Maria Callas's house to the other place. So it's some word association. I know I forget the term, but there's this the Greek ship that gets rebuilt.
The ship of
And-
The ship of
Theseus.
Yeah. So I was wondering if you saw that thread through your projects, because I was thinking that the coal project and the pigs, and so I mean, how does that figure in your work if you've thought about it or something like that?
That's amazing.
We've been thinking about the ship. I mean, in Greece, this question of the ship thesis came up because it's an interesting idea as to whether your body itself is a commons, right? Because as we talked about in the workshop 2 days ago, we are not the only passengers of the ship that we're in. There are millions of other passengers, other life forms in our bodies. And the ship of thesis metaphor is about the continuity of the passengers. So one of the passengers in this ship is me. And the ship is being repaired until it can't get repaired. And this question of recognizing each other both as people with a memory of ourselves. So, I mean, it's a very interesting exercise to look at. I've been looking at passport size photo, the passport photograph that is now on my passport, and the passport photograph that I had when I made my first passport when I was 16 years old or 17 years old. It is recognizably the same person, and it is a very different person, and it is recognizably the same person as my father would have been at a certain time, as my grandfather would have been at a certain time. There are these family resemblances between generations, but there is also a family resemblance in my own life. The person I was when I was 17 has a kind of resemblance to the person that I am now. It is not, I mean, none of the tissues, there's only one bone in the body that stays the same size and the same shape, which is a bone in the inner ear. Everything else changes. And our iris stays the same size.
Basically, you are not the same person in that sense. Nothing is there.
But it isn't. So if we look at the history of our work and the relationship between one work and the next, there is a kind of infectious property that one work has vis-a-vis another and another. And the infection is not only in the forward direction of time. It's not the past. It's not only the past that is infecting the present and the future. But I think that increasingly also the future is infecting the past. So we are now beginning, like this work of the handprint is changed by the work that has happened after it.
Well, and also in that sense of providence, like you don't know what's going to come, but that's probably affecting you too. The not knowing the future affects the present as much as. So we've talked about this we wrote, because we're anti-manifesto for a collective, we actually wrote a letento, but there is one line which says neither the arrow nor the boomerang of time. Like if one doesn't think of time as an arrow or as a boomerang, what other this thing can you find? Then, because a letento is that which is not manifest, that which is not clear. So how does one think of something exists? Yeah.
But you can sense it. It doesn't exist.
But you can sense it.
Otherwise, we'll wake up in the morning and
Exactly.
We
Exactly.
have to sense things in the future.
Any other? Yes.
Okay, I think that's good to end on a good note. So let's give them a round of applause. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you everybody for coming. Good night.